In April of 2010, I was battling severe anorexia. Truth be told, I still am. This illness had nearly taken my life the year prior and seen me hospitalised twice, bedridden and tube-fed. Bone thin and covered in fine down hairs from malnourishment, I was picked on for the way that I looked. I'd just stopped living with my father for the first time since I was born, and my mother was 8 months pregnant at 45. I was a 15-year-old student at a private girls' school in Hobart. One morning, after an outpatient checkup, I arrived late to discover the rest of my Year 10 classmates were attending a driving lesson off campus that I'd completely forgotten about. Lapses like these weren't uncommon at this time. I was barely there. One of the senior teachers noticed me walking around aimlessly in the courtyard. He was well respected, the head of maths and science, at the school for nearly 20 years. He taught me in Year 9. I thought he was funny. He told me he had a free period and asked if I'd come and chat with him in his office. He asked me about my illness. I talked. He listened. He promised to help me, to guide me in my recovery. As a teenager with no frame of reference and therefore thinking nothing odd of this, I told my mother about our conversation when I came home that day. My parents had a meeting with the school principal soon after, requesting that this teacher stay away from me. But in the meeting that I then had with the school principal and this senior teacher, I remember having to apologise. I had to apologise to him for putting him in this position, in front of the principal. I was told I had done something wrong. Baffled though I was, I believed I had. Thus, the first seeds of terror, confusion, and self-doubt had been sown in my mind. Indeed, it didn't make sense. In secret, he was adamant that I still come to see him, to talk. My parents were against me, he insisted. I was not to tell them because they simply wouldn't understand. Pregnant women, he said, were full of hormones. That must have been why my mother and I were arguing. He gave me a key to his office where there was always music playing, and it was always the same music, Simon and Garfunkel. Over a period of months, he built my trust to a point where I felt safe sharing my fears and past trauma that underpinned my illness, like my experience of being sexually abused as a 6-year-old by an older child who told me to undress in a closet before molesting me. He told me he would never hurt me, until he did, by way of a masterful reenactment I didn't see coming, with a closet and an instruction to undress. Most of you know my story from there. That is, how I lost my virginity to a 58-year-old pedophile and spent the next 6 months being raped by him at school nearly every day on the floor of his office. When I finally reported him to police, they found 28 multimedia files of child pornography on his computer. But as per the lasting impact of intense and manipulative grooming, and a mere 4 months after the abuse, I effectively defended him in my statement. Still only 16 then, I was terrified he would find out that I had betrayed him and that he would kill me. He was sentenced to 2 years and 10 months in jail for maintaining a sexual relationship with a person under the age of 17. Repairing myself in the aftermath of all this was certainly not a simple, linear undertaking. For every step forward, there were steps back, to the side, and some almost off the edge. I saw counsellor after counsellor, but I also abused drugs, drank, moved overseas, cut myself, threw myself into study, dyed my hair, made amazing friendships, got ugly tattoos, worked for my childhood hero, found myself in violent relationships, practiced yoga, even became a yoga teacher. I starved, I binged, and I starved again. One of the toughest challenges on my road to recovery was trying to speak about something we are taught is unspeakable. I felt completely disconnected from myself and everyone around me. Many people didn't know how to respond. That said, the ones who listened, the ones who were eager to understand even when they couldn't, made all the difference. Still, the doubt lingered. How could I have been so stupid as to not see what this man was doing from the outset? Was it my fault? Should I have known it was a lie when he said that he learned more from me than any of his other students. Maybe I should have been more alarmed when he asked me if I knew where my clitoris was and then laughed at me when I said no. It was when the perpetrator was released after serving only 19 months for abusing me almost every day, maintaining a sexual relationship with me as a 15-year-old, and then spoke freely on Facebook and to the media about how awesome and enviable it was, that I realised we had this all around the wrong way. Add the fact that this man was awarded a federally funded PhD scholarship to the only university in my home state while my mother was studying there. My mother, who hadn't had the opportunity to do so growing up. She soon dropped out because of his presence, but he remained. In fact, he was put into student accommodation with fresh 17 and 18-year-old undergraduates. And despite multiple reports to police by fellow students of his predatory behaviour, and despite once again being convicted and jailed for his vulgar public comments during his PhD tenure, he was eventually awarded a doctorate. After all this, it became quite obvious to me why child sexual abuse remains ubiquitous in our society. Because while predators retain the power to get exactly what they want, to feign remorse, and to objectify their targets through free speech, the innocent, survivors and bystanders alike, are burdened by shame-induced silence. In 2017, I connected with groundbreaking freelance journalist and fellow survivor, my dear friend Nina Fennell. I felt I needed to share my story publicly under my own name to raise awareness and educate others about sexual abuse and the prolonged psychological manipulation that belies it. Yet, after months of recounting re-traumatizing details tirelessly transposed by Nina, we discovered we were barred from sharing them by Section 194K of Tasmania's Evidence Act, which made it illegal for survivors of child sexual abuse to be identified in the media, even after turning 18, even with their consent. Using my case as the foundation, Nina created the Let Her Speak campaign to reform this law. We were then joined by 16 other brave survivors who lent their stories to the cause. The law was officially changed in April last year, almost 10 years to the day from the beginning of my story. It is so important for our nation, the whole world in fact, to listen to survivors' stories. Whilst they are disturbing to hear, the reality of what goes on behind closed doors is more so. And the more details we omit for fear of disturbance, the more we soften these crimes, the more we shield perpetrators from the shame that is resultantly misdirected to their targets. When we share, we heal, reconnect, and grow, both as individuals and as a united, strengthened collective. History, lived experience, the whole truth, unsanitized and unedited, is our greatest learning resource. It is what informs social and structural change. The upshot of allowing predators a voice but not survivors encourages the criminal behaviour. Through working with Nina, finally winning the right to speak, and talking with fellow campaign survivors and countless other women and men who have since come forward, it has become clear that there is the potential to do so much more to support survivors of child sexual abuse to thrive in life beyond their trauma, and more so to end child sexual abuse. It is my mission to do so, and it begins right now. As a fortunate nation, we have a particular obligation to protect our most vulnerable, our innocent children, and especially those who are further disadvantaged through circumstance, being part of a minority group, or geographical location. And there are 3 key areas that we can focus on to achieve this. Number 1, how we invite, listen, and accept the conversation and lived experience of child sexual abuse survivors. You've heard me say it before, it all starts with conversation. Number 2, what we do to expand our understanding of this heinous crime, in particular the grooming process, through both formal and informal education. Number 3, how we provide a consistent national framework that supports survivors and their loved ones, not just in their recovery, but also to disempower and deter predators from action. So what is it that we must do? First and foremost, let's keep talking about it. It's that simple. Let's start by opening up. It is up to us as a community, as a country, to create a space, a national movement, where survivors feel supported and free to share their truths. Let's drive a paradigm shift of shame away from those who have been abused and onto abusive behaviour. Let's share the platform to remind all survivors that their individual voice matters amongst the collective. Every story is imbued with unique, catalytic, educative potential that can only be told by its subject. Let us genuinely listen, actively, without judgment, and without advice, to demonstrate empathy and reassure that it is and never was our fault. Further to this point, while I must express my unflinching gratitude for this newfound platform and the unique opportunities for learning and growth that come with it, I would like to take this particular opportunity to directly address the media with a constructive reminder, the need for which has become starkly apparent to me this past month. Hosts, reporters, journalists, I say to you, listening to survivors is one thing. Repeatedly expecting people to relive their trauma on your terms, without our consent, without prior warning, is another. It's sensation. It's commodification of our pain. It's exploitation. It's the same abuse. Of all the many forms of trauma, rape has the highest rate of PTSD. Healing from trauma does not mean it is forgotten, nor that the symptoms will never be felt again. Trauma lives on in our cells. Our unconscious bodies are steps ahead of our conscious minds. When we are triggered, we are inevitably at the mercy of our emotional brain. In this state, it is impossible to discern between past and present. Such is re-traumatization. I cried more than once while writing this. Just because I've been recognised for my story does not mean it's fair game anywhere, anytime. It also doesn't mean it gets any easier to tell. I may be strong, yes, but I am human just like everyone else. None of us are invincible. By definition, truths cannot be forced. So grant us the respect and patience to share them on our own terms, rather than barking instructions like, take us back to your darkest moment, and tell us about being raped. The cycle of abuse cannot be broken simply by replaying case histories. We cannot afford to backtrack, else we will go round in circles, trapped in a painful narrative, and we'll all get tired, both as speakers and listeners. We'll want to switch off and give up, and retreat once more into silence. On average, it takes 23.9 years for survivors of child sexual abuse to be able to speak about their experiences. Such is the success of predators at instilling fear and self-doubt in the minds of their targets. More so than they are masters of destroying our trust in others, perpetrators are masters of destroying our trust in our own judgment, in ourselves. Such is the power of shame. A power, though, that is no match for love. When I disclosed my abuse to another of my teachers, Dr. William Simon, his absolute belief in me was the only assurance I needed to tell the police. It helped me recover a little of my lost faith in humanity. There certainly isn't a single rigid solution. Solutions will naturally come in due course by allowing and enabling voices to be heard. Certainly, talking about child sexual abuse won't eradicate it, but we can't fix a problem we don't discuss. And so it begins with conversation, which brings me to my second point. From there, we need to expand the conversation to create more awareness and education, particularly around the process of grooming. Grooming. It's a concept that makes us wince and shudder, and as such, we rarely hear about it. to the benefit of perpetrators. While it haunts us and we avoid properly breaking it down, the complexity and secrecy of this criminal behaviour is what predators thrive on. In turn, we enable them to charm and manipulate not just their targets, but all of us at once: family, friends, colleagues, and community members. And this must stop. Our discomfort, our fear, and resulting ignorance needs to stop giving perpetrators the protection, power, and confidence that allows them to operate. As a start, we should all be aware of what has been identified as the 6 phases of grooming, which certainly ring true in my experience. Number 1, targeting. That is, identifying a vulnerable individual. In my case, I was an innocent child, but I was also anorexic with significant change happening at home. Number 2, gaining trust. That is, establishing a friendship and falsely lulling the target into a sense of security by empathizing and assuring safety. For me, that was what I thought was listening to my challenges, empathizing with my situation, and providing me a safe space to retreat to when I needed it. Number 3, filling a need. That is, playing the person that fills the gap in the target's mental and emotional support. In my case, although I was surrounded by an incredibly attentive family and team of medical professionals, most of their support came in the form of tough love. The teacher thus assumed the role of sympathizer, telling me everything I wanted to hear. Number 4, isolating. That is, driving wedges between the target and their genuine supporters. This involves pushing certain people away, but exploiting others. I remember studying the film Iron-Jawed Angels that year in history. In one of the scenes, the main character is force-fed, much like I had been. Aware of my distress upon seeing this, my history teacher quietly led me out of the classroom. I said nothing, but she took me straight to his office, where she left me with him, panicked, in tears. It wasn't until many years later that I questioned why she and other staff would take me to him when I was upset. Staff he privately mocked and referred to as the Menopausal Virgins Club. He must have told them. Number 5, sexualizing. That is, gradually introducing sexual content so as to normalize it. In my case, in conjunction with subtly explicit conversation, I was carefully exposed to material that glorified relationships between characters with significant age differences. There was one film in particular he made me watch called The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, the last line of which is, "Give me a girl at an impressionable age, and she is mine for life." And remember how I said Simon and Garfunkel was always playing? Their music was the soundtrack to The Graduate. He made me watch that too. And thus, both literally and figuratively, it was the sound of silence, haunting and unending, that underscored my experience of pedophilic abuse. You know the lyrics. The vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence. Number 6, maintaining control. That is, striking a perfect balance between causing pain and providing relief from that pain, to condition the target to feel guilt at the thought of exposing a person who also appears to care for them. By way of physical intimidation combined with veiled threats, abusers scare you into silent submission. At over 6 foot, he towered above me. He once told me a story about a friend of his who sought revenge on a woman by digging her eyes out with a spoon. He told me he'd killed people as a soldier. He'd also sit outside on my street at night in his car to watch me undress through the window. I was already embarrassed by my changing shape as a young teenager in eating disorder recovery. But I remember standing naked behind his desk after he had just raped me and asking him if he thought I was fat. He looked me up and down and said, Well, you could do with some more exercise, like I was a dog. But he also told me I was beautiful. See how it is all stiflingly, painfully complex. But as we talk more about child sexual abuse, our lived experiences and what we know, our understanding of this premeditated evil will continue to develop. We need to warn our children, age appropriately, of the signs and characteristic behaviours, whilst educating how to report it should it happen to them or to those around them. This is a serious enough topic, unfortunately too common in occurrence for us to hope that kids know this. So I challenge our education system to look for ways to more formally educate our children, because we know that education is our primary means of prevention. And finally, to my third point, we need structural change, a national system that supports and protects survivors and deals with crimes in proportion to their severity. Let's start by considering the implications of linguistics related to offences. Through Let Her Speak campaign efforts, we saw the wording of my abuser's charge officially changed from maintaining a sexual relationship with a person under the age of 17 to the persistent sexual abuse of a child. Now think about the difference in the crime according to the language of both of these. Think about the message it sends to the community. Think about the message it sends survivors, where empathy is placed, where blame is placed, and how punishment is then given. We need to protect our children not just from the physical, mental, and emotional pain of these hideous crimes, but from the long-lasting, sometimes lifelong trauma that accompanies it. Whilst national structural change is no small feat, nor is educating our children on the dangers and complexities of grooming, it is work that needs to be done, and we need to start somewhere. Let's start by reviewing our linguistics and by agreeing between ourselves. In Australia, we have 8 state and territory jurisdictions and 8 different definitions of consent. We need to agree on something as absolute as what consent is. We need a uniform state and federal national standard and definition of consent. Only then can we effectively teach this fundamentally important principle consistently around Australia. Since I was announced as Australian of the Year just over a month ago, hundreds of fellow child sexual abuse survivors have reached out to me to tell their stories, to cry with me. Stories they thought they would take with them to the grave out of shame for being subjected to something that was not their fault. Stories of a kind of suffering they had previously never been able to explain. Stories of grooming. I am one of the luckiest ones, who survived, who was believed, who was surrounded by love. And what this shows me is that despite this problem still existing, and despite a personal history of trauma that is still ongoing, it is possible to heal, to thrive, and live a wonderful life. It is my mission and my duty as a survivor, and as a survivor with a voice, to continue working towards eradicating child sexual abuse. I won't stop until it does. And so, I leave you with these 3 messages. Number 1, to our government, our decision makers, and our policy makers. We need reform on a national scale, both in policy and education, to address these heinous crimes so that they are no longer enabled to be perpetrated. Number 2, to my nation, the wonderful people of Australia. We need to be open, to embrace the conversation, new information, and take guidance from our experiences so we can inform change, so we can heal and prevent this happening to future generations. Number 3, and finally, to my fellow survivors. It is our time. We need to take this opportunity. We need to be bold and courageous. Recognise we have a platform on which I stand with you in solidarity and support. Share your truth. It is your power. One voice, your voice, and our collective voices can make a difference. We are on the precipice of a revolution whose call to action needs to be heard loud and clear. That's right, you got it. Let's keep making noise, Australia.